There we go. Good evening, Chancellor, JCU Council members, Provost, Deputy Vice Chancellors, Chief of Staff, Academic Board Chair, Head of Campus and Cairns, University Librarian, Ms. Gail Mabo, Professor Smallwood, distinguished guests, one and all. Welcome and good evening. Thank you for joining us here tonight at the Bebegu Yamba campus in Townsville and online from Thursday Island, Cairns, Mount Isa, and Mackay. It is hard for those of us who were adults at the time of the Mabo High Court decision to believe that it is now 40 years since Uncle Koiki Mabo gave a landmark speech to the Land Rights and Future of Australian Race Relations Conference held here at James Cook University. Next year, it will be 30 years since the Mabo decision was handed down by the High Court of Australia. This JCU annual Mabo Lecture series honours, celebrates and remembers Uncle Koiki's determination and achievements as a proud Meriam man who understood Malo's law, the traditional law, and worked to have it recognised as an activist who worked on behalf of the Torres Strait Islander community in this city and as a revered former employee of this university. The lecture series honours him by highlighting the ongoing work of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, as well as the contributions that non-Indigenous people make towards our cause. The JCU Koiki Mabo Library stands today as his permanent memorial on this campus where he once worked. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Martin Nakada, Pro-Vice Chancellor of Indigenous Education and Strategy here at James Cook University, and a Kulkalite man from the Torres Strait Islands. This evening's lecture on Indigenous heroes and heroines will be delivered by Emeritus Professor John Maynard from University of Newcastle, an outstanding historian and with ancestral roots in Warramai country in New South Wales. We are very grateful that you could take time from your busy schedule, John, to deliver this lecture tonight. James Cook University is very proud to be on Bindal country, and we are blessed to have with us tonight Professor Grayson Smallwood to do the traditional welcome.
Thank you, Professor Nakada, and I'd like to pay my respects to everyone here today and the ones watching on Zoom, and say Watamuli as a Bindal Birragubba elder and having 50 years connections to this amazing university, Bebegu Yamba. I'd like to pay my respects to the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Martin Nakada, Professor Coughlin, and all my colleagues, because I'm still associated here as an adjunct, Gail Mabo, and to all the university staff and students. It's an absolute honour to have Professor John Maynard here, such a humble man and a brilliant historian, and has done so much heavy work in this country about the true history. And just briefly, I was a student during Uncle Koiki Mabo's time here at when he was the yardman, and would regularly go for his breaks to the library under the supervision of Professor Henry Reynolds, Professor Noel Luce. It was just amazing times, and I remember, and as a teenager, going to his house when he constantly talked about real sovereignty, not the watered down land rights that were Native Title Act that we have today, but he constantly promoted history, culture, but also the importance of black schools, the importance of our students achieving when they're in a system, a colonial system, and they're proud of their heritage. He made a comment to me one day, as back then I was a crazy activist. I'm a gentle old great-grandmother now at 70. And he said to me, "What are you studying?" And I said, "I'm trying to do a Bachelor of Arts, Uncle." And he said, "Well, I attend the library more than you." And he said, "So you need to start going to the library. You need to get this degree out of the way, and you'll have all of that history and backing for your activism. He never said a truer word, and I had the privilege of spending a lot of time with Professor Paul Coe, who did the first Coe versus the Crown, and spent a lot of time with those brilliant activists in Redfern. And whilst that failed, Uncle Koiki and the 6 other plaintiffs pushed and pushed with the support of the country. And today, and I want to thank James Cook University for this series, because I'm very optimistic that the younger generation, black and white, will be united once the true history is told, and then we can reconcile together. Thank you, Professor Nakata, for giving me the honour out here, and I look forward to the lecture, and Watamuli, and God bless you all. Thank you.
Can I now invite Professor Coughlin, Provost of James Cook University, to do the official JCU welcome.
Watamuli, welcome. Welcome to one and all. Can I first acknowledge Auntie Grayson for your welcome to country, and may I pay my respects also to the traditional owners, not here, just here at Bebeguyamba, our Townsville campus, but at the other locations at which people are watching tonight's presentation. Can I also acknowledge the Chancellor, Mr. Bill Tavell, my friend and colleague, Mr. Professor John Maynard, Professor John Maynard, our speaker tonight, my other university colleagues here, and as I said, at the various other locations. It's a great coincidence that we're holding the Mabo Lecture tonight. It's Reconciliation Week, but also, and I think very significantly, the fact that the Uluru Statement from the Heart was recognised yesterday with a major national award is a very poignant moment for us, and who could have wished for a stronger coincidence of things happening than that. As some people have already acknowledged, the association that Eddie Koiki Mabo had with JCU is one of the most significant elements of our history. And it's with great pride that the university celebrates that particular association. As Auntie Graceland pointed out, Eddie was a member of the ground staff here from 1967 to 1971, and it was through his association with 2 of the professors, Professor Noel Luce and Professor Henry Reynolds, that the Mabo movement was effectively born. For many of us at JCU, the landmark decision is a personal one. It's a rendered a personal decision, as well as political and historic, because of Eddie's important association with JCU and the JCU staff and students. JCU has celebrated the history-making Mabo decision with the long-established Mabo Lecture series. As Martin pointed out, it's the 30th anniversary next year. Over the 30 years, there are many distinguished people who have attended and presented at the Mabo Lecture. If I can just name a few, the Honourable Leanne Enoch, who was at that time Minister for Housing and Public Works and Minister for Science and Innovation. A presentation in 2013 by Dr. Brian Keon Cohen, QC, who was one of the barristers involved in the Mabo case. Henry Reynolds himself presented in 2012. A presentation by Mr. McGuda, at the time Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commission. The Honourable Jenny Macklin, at the time Minister for Housing, Community Services and Indigenous Affairs. Professor Larissa Berndt, and in 2004, a presentation by Father Frank Brennan, AO. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge my colleague, Professor Martin Nakata, who has also delivered one of the Mabo lectures. In expressing welcome on behalf of the university, can I also acknowledge the traditional owners and observe that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people at this university contribute to the intellectual, the social and cultural life of this institution, and we are so much better for it. Thank you.
It's a great honour for me to now introduce this year's speaker, a Warramai man from the Port Stephens area of New South Wales and Professor of History at the University of Newcastle, Professor John Maynard. He's a person I have admired and respected as a friend and colleague since we both met and worked in Adelaide in the late 90s. He's married to another acclaimed historian, Professor Victoria Haskins, and more recently, just before I came home to James Cook and the far north, I had the pleasure of watching John and Victoria's son, Gunnar, how he grew and developed into a fine law student at the University of New South Wales. And I've since learned from John, Gunnar is now working as a lawyer with Free Hills Law Firm in Sydney. Might add that Gunnar started in the Nurrugili Indigenous Winter School program. Professor Maynard's interest in history began with wanting to piece together his family history. His grandfather was the late great Aboriginal activist, Fred Maynard, who in 1924 established the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association, which fought for land rights, Aboriginal people's control over their own affairs, and for the end of removing Aboriginal children from their families. Today, John is internationally regarded as an expert on a range of historical topics that include Aboriginal involvement in the military, Aboriginal political activism, Aboriginal sport, the stories of non-Indigenous people who ended up living with Aboriginal people in the colonial era, comparative US and Australian Indigenous historic experience in the early decades of the 20th century, to name just a few. Professor Maynard has served on numerous boards and councils over the years, including the Executive Committee of the Australian Historical Association, the New South Wales History Council, the Indigenous Higher Education Advisory Council, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, the History, Politics and Culture Node of the Indigenous Research and Knowledge Network, and is still involved as facilitator of the Purai Indigenous Global Indigenous Diaspora Research Centre at the University of Newcastle. Colleagues, we are very honoured to have such a prominent Indigenous historian with us tonight to deliver the 2021 Mabo Lecture.
Thanks very much, Martin, for that kind introduction, and Gracie for the welcome. And it's just a pleasure to be here. It's a great honour. As a Warramai man from the mid-north coast of New South Wales, I begin by respectfully acknowledging the traditional guardians of the land, the Bindal and Walgaruka people and their elders, both past and present. I am most privileged to be a visitor on country. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I also respectfully acknowledge members of the Mabo family here today. I take time to acknowledge and begin this lecture, acknowledge the man who this lecture commemorates, Koiki Eddie Mabo, who has left us all a legacy in courage, strength and resilience. He was an inspiring leader whose ideals remain as a guide to direct us into the future. His story also reminds us of the importance of history and in remembering the past. Koiki himself was a storyteller. He carried knowledge passed from generation to generation of his people. As such, he was armed with historical knowledge. And with such knowledge, he was able to challenge and overthrow the fiction of terra nullius, land belonging to no one, with the landmark Mabo decision. I am honoured as an Aboriginal historian to deliver this talk today, marking such a significant figure in Indigenous history. Now, I've spent the last 27 years restoring into Australian history Indigenous stories to inspire our Aboriginal young and old with the understanding that they have heroes and heroines embedded in our past. I have described our history space like a giant jigsaw puzzle with the majority of pieces missing. And I have been driven to find and put those missing pieces back into the puzzle. I came through a school system of the 1950s and 1960s when we were conveniently missed, overlooked, forgotten, or dare I say erased from the history books, except as a people belonging to the Stone Age or were a dying race. But in my own family, there were incredible histories of political struggle and triumph. My grandfather, Fred Maynard, pictured here with his sister Emma at the Rocks in 1927, and the manifesto his organisation put out in 1927. My grandfather, and Martin touched on this, was the leader of the first united all-Aboriginal political organisation to form in this country. In 1924, the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association, the AAPA. My grandfather's groups are credited with first tabling a national land rights agenda. They demanded enough land for each and every Aboriginal family in the country, calling for genuine Aboriginal self-determination. At a conference, their first annual conference in Sydney at Surrey Hills in 1925, they were front page news in the Sydney press. Aborigines demand self-determination. This is 1925. Self-determination is their aim. 50 years before the Whitlam government accredited with putting up self-determination for us. It was Aboriginal people who first put up self-determination. They also demanded that Aboriginal family life be left sacred, to defend the distinct Aboriginal cultural identity, and that Aboriginal people should be placed in charge of Aboriginal affairs. Koiki Mabo and my grandfather are just two examples of the many inspiring heroes we have in our past. And it is critically important to encourage young Indigenous people to take up history and recover more of our stories that have been made obscure. As Malcolm X once said, if you have no past, you have no future. It is important to recognise that while there are very few trained Indigenous historians in the country today, in every Indigenous community today, our people are putting back together their fractured family and community histories, right at this very moment. In truth, we all have heroes and heroines in our family's past, and it is imperative that these stories are revealed. Yet very few people realise that the archives are full of our voices. These voices from the past need to be released and their inspiration and impact realised for both our communities and the wider community's benefit. Despite the school texts and history books of the 1950s and 1960s telling me nothing of Aboriginal history and culture, I drew upon my own family for memory, records and inspiration. At a very early age, I developed a passion for reading, writing and storytelling. I was following a long tradition as our culture had historians across thousands of years as storytellers. We had words to describe history. In the Awabakal language of Newcastle, it was Yuriki, long ago, since, past. This is what's been recorded. The Warramai, my people from Port Stephens, called it Dungay, for formerly or long time ago. Of course, even this history has its own history. Clearly, these are Aboriginal words defining an understanding of a long past or history. As Billy Griffiths put it so succinctly, like all things cultural, the dreaming must have a history. It must have arisen out of human practice somewhere in the deep past. So history has a long tradition for us and is passed down to each succeeding generation. Growing up, my greatest hero was my late father, Mervyn Maynard. Pictured here, he passed away in 2018. My father grew up in very hard times for our people and witnessed the realities of injustice and hardship firsthand. Because of my grandfather, Fred Maynard, being such an outspoken activist on Aboriginal rights nearly 100 years ago, the family suffered continual police surveillance, harassment and intimidation. In a 1927 interview, my grandfather said, and I quote, he had been warned on many occasions that the doors of Long Bay Jail were opening for him. He would chiefly go to jail for the remainder of his life, he declared, if by so doing he could make the people of Australia realise the truly frightful administration of the Aborigines Act. He knew where children were torn from their mothers and sent into absolute slavery. My father recalled a story to me later in his life. Him and another young Purai boy in the late 1930s, when he was about 5 or 6, were picked up by the police at Lakemba, and they were taken to the police station at Canterbury. My father said it was the most frightening and terrifying day of his life in that police station with the police. Remember, 5 or 6-year-old kids, Purai kids in this police station. My father had a long career as a jockey. I've seen my father on life support and in intensive care units for weeks at a time. I mean, probably broke nearly every bone in his body as a jockey in a career that went across 60-odd years. Yet he said this was the most frightening moment in his life. And he said it wasn't until much later as an adult that he realised what it was all about. It was all about the police getting the message through to my grandfather, his father, saying, we can pick up your kids any time we like, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it. When my grandfather died in 1946, my grandmother, Minnie, a white woman, had to raise 4 Aboriginal children herself on £2 a fortnight from St Vincent's de Paul. My grandmother had suffered resentment and racism directed towards her family for daring to marry an Aboriginal man in 1928. Her own family had cut her off for marrying an Aboriginal man. They weren't a well-to-do family. They weren't even a middle-class family. They were a poor white mining family. And my grandmother was a single mother when she met my grandfather. But for marrying an Aboriginal man in 1928, particularly a very outspoken one, the family completely cut her off. It certainly was not the done thing in that time period, especially him being such an outspoken opponent of the government policy and the actions of the police. Just to quickly touch on my father, I wrote a book about Aboriginal jockeys. I mean, I grew up on the racecourse and I knew so many Aboriginal jockeys. And yet where were they in the racing history? This was another missing history, which was why I wrote the book. There's been 3 editions of that book since 2002, 2003 and 2013, I think, off the top of my head. My father's career started in 1948 and he was still riding in 1994. He rode over 1,500 winners and he rode group enlisted winners in 4 countries, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore and Malaysia. He rode in the Melbourne Cup. He rode in 3 Caulfield Cups. He even rode for Sir Frank Packer, Kerry Packer's father. And he met the Queen at her request at Randwick on a visit to Australia in 1992 because as an 18-year-old apprentice, he won the first Queen's Cup at Randwick as an 18-year-old. But she didn't get here. Her father died that year when she was on her way to Australia and they went back. So he'd always said to me and the rest of the family, except for that bloody king dying, I would have met the Queen. And lo and behold, in 1992, the Queen made a request on a visit to Australia. She would like to meet Mervyn Maynard, the first jockey to win the Queen's Cup. So that's how it come about. My father was a very humble and proud man, and he was an incredible inspiration to me through life on how to live your life and how to do the right thing and look after your family. In this 21st century, it is now critically important that the country moves towards a process of truth-telling and that we examine, discuss, and then can deal with and heal from the past. We Aboriginal people suffer through intergenerational trauma as a direct result, and the whole Australian nation, for me, carries a sickness from not dealing with the past. A quote from the African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois in 1935 describes our dilemma. And he said, nations reel and stagger on their way. They make hideous mistakes. They commit frightful wrongs. They do great and beautiful things. And shall we not best guide humanity by telling the truth about all this, so far as the truth is ascertainable? We know how difficult it is to get the facts or truth today. We are bombarded with fake news, the influence of social media, Rupert Murdoch and Fox Media, world leaders like Donald Trump, and an avalanche of conspiracy theories. I feel we are now in a time period where not just Aboriginal history is devalued and dismissed, but history as a profession or course to study is actually under threat. It is unquestionably a critical time globally for humanities and history across the university sector, as governments worldwide are pushing universities to focus on the STEM subjects: science, technology, engineering, mathematics, health and vocational training. Whilst humanities courses, including history, are facing cuts and closure. I am not implying that these STEM subjects are not important areas to study. They are. But more than ever, it is critical, as noted British historian Richard Evans said, for people to develop the skills of a historian, to look critically at the evidence and to distinguish fact from fiction. History as a subject skills people up from all backgrounds with the skills to navigate modern life. It gives us all the tools to understand the present. When I first started out, I was just undertaking a family history project focused on my grandfather and his role as an early Aboriginal political activist. My father had grabbed me and said, I was out of work. And I think he thought I was wasting my time. And he said, you need something to do. I want you to write up the old man's story. I mean, basically, it was no greater vision than writing it up for our family in a nice exercise book and some of the photographs we had, letters that he'd written, and some newspaper things. And I would then go into the archives and the libraries and dig out as much as I could and write it up. But of course, I went to Wallatuka at the University of Newcastle, and Tracy Bunder, a Murray Aboriginal woman who was the director at that time, kidnapped me into a diploma course, and the rest is history, as they say. Diploma, a BA and a PhD, and 12 books later, here I am. I was just putting our family history together, but my work and findings has assisted Aboriginal people and communities across the country to undertake their own history projects. I did not direct my work towards the university. It was from the outset aimed towards Aboriginal people to read, enjoy and gain inspiration from. Additionally, I wanted to inform the wider non-Indigenous community of the history they did not know. As part of my journey, I realised over time of the relevance and importance of these untold stories to all. And there are many of these stories. I now want to emphasise the importance of history by examining the lives of three lesser-known Indigenous heroes, two males and a woman. One a sports star, a political activist, and a war hero, namely Dave Sands, Jane Duran and Douglas Grant. These are not the stories of kings and queens or discoverers or explorers or generals, but of ordinary people whose stories are embedded with courage, tragedy and inspiration. I begin with Dave Sands, a Dunghutti Aboriginal man originally from Burnt Bridge on the north coast of New South Wales, close to the town of Kempsey. Dave Sands was a world-class boxer, and sadly he never won the world title his talent so richly deserved. He was killed in a trucking accident in 1952 before he had the opportunity of challenging for the title. His funeral was one of the biggest ever witnessed in Newcastle, with 15,000 people lining the streets in pouring rain to pay their respects. He was just 26 years of age and left a young non-Indigenous widow and three young children, with a fourth child, another daughter, on the way. Sands had earned about £30,000 from his ring career, but it was discovered on his death that his money had been consumed on managers' fees. He took a great swag of money away from Dave, travel costs, tax, family expenses and generosity to his kin. A public appeal in Newcastle raised more than £2,500, sufficient to pay off his Stockton home and create a trust fund for his family. Arguably the greatest Aboriginal boxer of all time, Dave Sands had at the age of 15 followed his older brother Percy to Newcastle to pursue a boxing career and train out of Tom Maguire's backyard gym in Beaumont Street, Hamilton in Newcastle. They were eventually joined by their brothers Clem, George, Alf and Russell, the Fighting Sands brothers, all of whom boxed with great success. All of the brothers wore green satin boxing shorts with a white star. But David was the outstanding fighter of the family. holding the British Empire title, as well as the Australian middleweight, light heavyweight and heavyweight titles all at the same time. 3 different weight divisions. If Dave Sands went down to the Big Smoke to fight in Sydney at the stadium, large crowds of fans would pack Tom Lemming's Golden Gloves boxing gym at 49 Glebe Point Road. That's Glebe Books, is where the gym was. To watch him spar and work out. He also trained at the nearby Victoria Park in front of enthusiastic onlookers as cars and buses all stopped just to watch him run and exercise in the park. He was on the verge of gaining a world title fight at the time of his death in the trucking accident. He and his brothers had been out timber getting just to get an extra bit of money when the truck rolled, and the only one injured was Dave, the driver. Carl Bobo Olsen would be crowned world middleweight champion in October 1953 after defeating Randolph Turpin for the vacant title at Madison Square Garden in New York. Now, Olsen would say after his victory, if that Australian was still alive, this title would be his. Dave Sands had beaten both Carl Olsen and Randolph Turpin soundly in 2 fights. The man today recognised as pound for pound the greatest middleweight of all time, Sugar Ray Robinson, had refused to fight Dave Sands. Dave Sands' exploits in the ring inspired many young Aboriginal men to pursue a boxing career. The great social and political changes of the 1960s, including the overwhelming 1967 referendum result, released Aboriginal people from the tight, restrictive government controls over their lives, and thousands flocked to Sydney and Redfern, looking for better working opportunities. Many of the young men were also keen on looking to sport to provide a financial bonus, and boxing was the big draw card. Redfern community leader Lyle Munro Jr. reflected, led by Dave Sands and Ron Richards, Aboriginal boxers were the early heroes and warriors who led us off the missions with their successes. Dave helped us believe that we could compete. Many of the sites connected with Dave Sands remain around the Newcastle area, including memorials at the site of the gymnasium where he trained, the old Newcastle Stadium site, a Stockton Sports Oval pavilion with the plaque in Dave's honour, and another monument near the Stockton Ferry Wharf, and of course his headstone at Sandgate Cemetery. There have been a number of stories passed on to me regarding Dave Sands. The Tom Maguire Gymnasium was directly across the road from Broadmeadow Racecourse, where a number of Aboriginal jockeys rode during the 1940s and 50s, including my father and others like Stan Johnson, Gordon Taylor and Normie Rose. My father told me that Dave and his brothers used to do their road work by running around and around a Broadmeadow Racecourse to build up stamina and endurance. On the non-Indigenous side of the family, my mother and auntie stated that Dave Sands was the most gorgeous man you could imagine. My auntie said when Dave Sands walked along Hunter Street, the main street of Newcastle, all of the girls would be standing to the side giggling and saying, "G'day, Dave." Sands would just smile and walk on. I've been fortunate to interview some people with memories of the great boxer, including of a story of how at his Stockton home, the garage had been fitted out with bunk beds to accommodate family and friends who might be staying in town. But Dave had a firm rule. There was to be no alcohol or people under the influence of alcohol on the property. Now, if someone came home drunk, this was the interview that I did, they said the light on the back of the house would come on. Didn't matter what time it was, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And footsteps would be heard coming down the path. The garage light would be switched on and Dave would be there in his dressing gown carrying 2 sets of boxing gloves, and he would point at the perpetrator and indicate for him to get up and put the gloves on. And then he was instructed, the wrongdoer was instructed on the errors of his ways and not to break the law again. Another story that has taken on legendary status in Newcastle was during the Second World War. 2 of the younger Sands brothers were on Newcastle Beach when they were confronted by 3 American GI soldiers who were based in Newcastle at the time. The GIs, in no uncertain racist terms, said, "Get off this beach, you black bastards." Dave Sands had turned up and, hearing the disturbance on the beach, strode down, informing the US soldiers to refrain and apologise to his brothers, upon which the men let loose with a fusillade of further abuse directed at Dave. The story says that Dave Sands threw 3 punches and knocked out the 3 soldiers, who were all left lying out cold on the sand at Newcastle Beach. Next year, it will be 70 years since Dave Sands' death. He was a remarkable boxer and man, and remains as an inspiring individual. My second hero is Douglas Grant, the Black Digger. Douglas Grant is one of the better-known Aboriginal servicemen of the First World War. His life was the stuff a Hollywood film director could only dream of. As a so-described full-blood baby, he was saved by the chief taxidermist of the Australian Museum in Sydney, Robert Grant, and his family. In Sydney, Robert Grant, after his family were killed in a punitive expedition of white settlers and native police, apparently launched from the colonial outpost of Cairns. This vigilante group had massacred a large group of Aboriginal people, and the baby was the lone survivor. Robert Grant and his wife had been in Queensland collecting artefacts for the museum at the time of the massacre. They legally adopted the baby on their return to Sydney. Douglas was raised on equal footing with the Grant's other children living in Annandale. He received a very good education and later qualified as a draftsman and wool classer. During the First World War, he followed several of his workmates and volunteered for the army in 1915. After enlistment, he sat the sergeant's examination successfully, in his previous training with the cadet movement being of a great advantage. It was noted that he was a wonderfully accurate rifle shot, and at the Rutherford military training encampment just before leaving Australia, hit the running target 30 times with consecutive shots at 1,000 yards. When about to leave Australia for overseas active service, Grant was shocked to be discharged because of regulations preventing Aborigines leaving the country without government approval. Probably through his adopted family connections and influence, he managed to quietly re-enlist and finally embarked for France to join the 13th Battalion. He was wounded in the First Battle of Bullecourt and captured by the Germans. He would spend the rest of the war as a prisoner in the Wittenberg and Wunsdorf Ziesen camps. He became an exotic curiosity for German doctors, scientists, and anthropologists. The Germans recognised Grant as a well-educated leader with great organisational and administrative abilities. He was also nominated by the other prisoners to act and speak on their behalf, becoming president of the British Health Committee and organising the distribution of Red Cross food parcels, comforts and medical supplies. One of the German scientists described him as an unmistakable figure and noted the other prisoners afforded him great respect for his honesty, his quick mind, and because he was aggressively Australian. After the war and his return to Sydney, he returned to his position as a draftsman with Mort's Dock and Engineering Company in Sydney. He enjoyed a brief spell as a celebrity of war, as a war hero, but he was clearly unsettled and disturbed by his war experiences. He moved to Lithgow, working in a small arms factory, where a report in the Sydney Sun said he was immensely popular. He became the secretary of the Lithgow Returned Soldiers League, and he conducted a weekly diggers session on the commercial radio station. It was whilst in Lithgow that Grant read in the newspapers that a local rugby league team had been put out of the competition because they had a number of Aboriginal players in their team, and the other teams refused to play them. Grant wrote a response into the press where he stated his displeasure, highlighting there had been no colour bar in the trenches on the Western Front. Now, it was during this period that Grant became more and more outspoken on the issues facing Aboriginal people in the country. In 1929, following the shocking massacre of a recorded 31 Aboriginal people at Coniston in the Northern Territory, he stated the massacre was damning in the extreme. It shows the utter lack of the law and order and protection that is theirs by law, the same government whose officers shot these unfortunate natives. He later stated that when his people called for justice, they are answered with the lash and the gun. Grant returned to Sydney in the early 1930s. He'd sadly descended into alcoholism. The loss of his step-family left a hole in his life too difficult to fill, and certainly his war experiences was hanging over his head. Despite having been at one time a friend of the likes of poet Percy Cowan and writer Henry Lawson, Grant found that acceptance in the wider community was now a thing of the past. On one Anzac Day in Sydney, an ex-serviceman, Roy Kinghorn, noted Douglas outside the Domain. Roy encouraged Douglas to attend, but Douglas said to him, "No, I'm not wanted anymore. I think I'm better out here. I've lived long enough to see that I don't belong anywhere and they don't want me." At one point, as a result of his war trauma, he was patient at the Callan Park Mental Hospital. Nevertheless, his abilities were utilised at the hospital as a clerk. He lived on site and as an architect oversaw patients design and construct a replica of Sydney Harbour Bridge, which the Governor-General inspected. And you can see that image there with the Governor-General there, and there's the replica that Grant helped the patients construct. Grant also put forward an official application to be considered as the architect of new cottages to be built for the Aboriginal community at La Perouse, contending that because he was an Aborigine, he knew and understood the needs of his people. He was overlooked for the job. He later lived at the Salvation Army Old Men's Quarters in Sydney, and after 1949 at the War Veterans House at La Perouse, he had lived a lonely life across the last decade of his life until his death in 1951. Douglas Grant Park in Annandale, New South Wales, was named in his honour in 2015. But another remarkable life. And what an incredible, brilliant mind this guy had, and so many talents. Finally, I'll speak of Jane Duran, the forgotten Aboriginal political warrior. Jane Duran, an Aboriginal Yuin woman from the south coast of New South Wales, remains as one of the great forgotten Aboriginal patriots, political patriots. Duran was a very prominent member of the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association, the AAPA, as I said earlier, headed by Fred Maynard, my grandfather, also pictured here. Her record and memory are largely tied with two significant moments. Today, there is much written of William Cooper's famous 1930s letter to the King, outlining the severe disadvantage suffered by the Aboriginal population at the hands of state and Commonwealth government. Cooper's letter sadly was never sent on by the Australian government to the King. Jane Duran, on the other hand, in 1926, did write a direct letter to the ruling monarch, and her letter did reach Buckingham Palace and was returned to Australia postmarked from the palace. Duran's impassioned plea highlighted the plight of Aboriginal children at Bateman's Bay being forced from the local school. This is 1926. She said, "I beg to state that it is months and months since those children were at school, and it is a shame to see them going about without education." She stated that the school was a public school, and if this was the case, why were Aboriginal kids denied their place in this so-called public institution? Duran declared that education was compulsory under state legislation, but this was obviously only the case if you were white. She informed the monarch that she had written to different places, namely the Minister of Education, Child Welfare Department, the Aborigines Protection Board, also to our members of Parliament, but I cannot get fair play. She powerfully illustrated her frustration at not being heard and concluded by revealing that the Aboriginal reserve land itself was under threat to white appropriation. Even the reserve land, where the coloured race were bred and born, the white race are trying to have them turned off to another piece of worthless land. It is unfair, and I hope you will see that fair play be given. Let them stay on the land that was granted to them. Duran did not receive a direct reply to her letter. Archival evidence reveals that the Governor-General received notification of the letter from the palace itself, and he delegated responsibility back to the New South Wales State Government to respond to her letter. And the Governor-General in his correspondence said, "I have the honour by His Majesty's command to transmit to you to be laid before your ministers the accompanying letter which has been addressed to His Majesty by Miss Jane Duran of Maruga, New South Wales, concerning the question of the education of coloured children at Bateman's Bay." Now, one can only speculate at the consternation and embarrassment that the revelation of this action and letter would have caused in the hallowed halls of the New South Wales State Parliament, particularly the Aborigines Protection Board itself. They would have been highly uncomfortable that their actions had been brought to the attention of the King himself. For them, the exposure was highly unsettling. Their practice of making decisions behind closed doors, that was their long-established habit of secrecy and unquestioned executive power, had been revealed to the highest seat of power in the Commonwealth. However, instead of the letter influencing the positive change, the Protection Board intensified their attacks against the Aboriginal activists. In late 1927, Jane Duran was again in the news when an article in the Sydney Morning Herald revealed she and Fred Maynard attended a meeting at St Andrew's Cathedral Chapter House, Sydney, with high-ranking church officials. Duran and Maynard made it clear that the AAPA wanted a repeal of the Aborigines Act. Duran strongly stated her dislike of the board. The Aborigines Protection Board was a nice name. She told officials of that office that when this kind of thing occurred, where did the protection come in? Influence was everything. If one did not have it, one got nowhere. The article revealed aspects of the discussion at St Andrews and the makeup of the Aboriginal delegation. Two of the natives were women, and one of them, Mrs Duran, astonished Bishop Darcy Irvine by saying she had written to the King. "To the King?" he asked. "Yes," replied Mrs Duran. "I addressed it to King George V of England." Duran emphasised that it was the stripping of Aboriginal lands that had driven her to write directly to the head of the empire. The land in question on the south coast had been reserved for Aboriginal use, but suddenly pressure had been applied to alienate it from their hands. "Do you think the King received it?" Bishop asked Darcy Irvine stated. "Well," replied Mrs Duran, "I registered it, so he must have." She admitted, however, that she did not receive a reply, but then added, "The land has not been sold." And that wasn't touched. So it did have an impact. Despite their appeal, the AAPA's hopes of widespread support among the religious brethren was sadly not forthcoming. The AAPA disappeared from public view in 1929, and evidence strongly suggests that police acting for the New South Wales Aborigines Protection Board hounded and harassed the organisation out of existence. That's very much a part of my book, Fight for Liberty and Freedom, the history of that organisation. There are some personal memories recorded of Jane Duran, who it was said loved to fish down on the south coast, and how she would sing whilst wetting a line, "A broken down squatter like me. What hope for a broken down squatter like me," she would sing. She was also noted as a keen euchre card player and attended many tournaments and won many trophies. Apparently, she was no mean musician on the concertina. Her talents as a musician were apparently much sought after, as she was frequently asked to accompany a Mr. Stevens harbour cruise in his launch in Sydney. She was also an invited guest on the American naval boat, the California, whilst it was in Sydney, entertaining some of the personnel with her songs and stories. Jane Duran passed away on the 13th of April 1947. It is important to recognise that as an Aboriginal woman, Jane Duran's story has been lost to history even more so than Dave Sands and Douglas Grant. Even so, we can find her voice in the archives. Aboriginal people stood up to injustice and can and will continue to do so. The stories of Dave Sands, Douglas Grant and Jane Duran have largely been overlooked in Australian history, but their rich and varied lives through difficult time periods for Aboriginal people showcases the tenacity, courage and determination of our people. These were individuals like Koiki Mabo, who were fighting against the strict and enforced barriers of exclusion that have impacted upon Indigenous lives for much of our history since 1788. They challenged what was understood to be the norm for Indigenous people and proved that we could achieve in an entirely disadvantaged world in total contradiction to the wider community's understanding and appreciation. In conclusion, this lecture has sought to impress not just the importance of Indigenous history, but how these missing stories of individuals can enhance the entire nation's history. History unquestionably is about stories and how many varied viewpoints of history capture the fabric of what makes a nation. It is the unknown treasures in our collective historical memory that ignite my passion for history. I am driven to reveal these gems of our past. These stories remain to inspire and enrich the nation on a past they have largely been deprived. I take time to salute all of the Indigenous heroes and heroines of our past and in honour in the memory of Koiki Mabo. Thank you for listening.
Well, thanks very much, John. Very inspiring to hear about the history of the effort that goes on in this country. And it's timely reminder for us all to reflect on some of those moments, because that's what drives us forward in the ways that we go about prioritising Indigenous lives today. We're now open for questions, and we're right on time, and you get an extra bottle of wine tonight. We've got some questions coming through online, but I was going to help you with that to drive that. Questions from the floor, reflections? Up the back there?
Oh, sorry, I think we're just going to start with Thursday one.
Okay. Yep. Who's on Thursday Island? Jordana?
Have any at the moment?
Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Mount Isa? Who's at Mount Isa? Any questions from Mount Isa? Great, thanks. And who's next?
Ken.
Cairns? Rory, have you got a question? Rory's a primary school kid that grew up on Thursday Island, and he comes to all the Mabo lectures. Say g'day.
Hi.
How's your schooling going, Rory?
Good.
Catching any fish?
Nah.
All right, any questions from Cairns?
No questions from Cairns.
Thanks, guys, for listening. Anyway.
Rory is a Scottish boy. He thinks he's an island boy.
I shouldn't have gone first. Firstly, thank you so much, Professor, for that lecture. That was incredible and fascinating. My question is about these political and protest movements. You mentioned that the police basically hounded the AAPA out of existence. It's now 100 years later. Do you see any, like as a historian, do you see any patterns of similarity in the way that governments engage with Indigenous movements, both political and also like extra political, like seeking progress outside of the existing political system? And if you do see some patterns, what are they and how can we learn from them?
Yeah, I think we've reached a critical time again, you know, with the George Floyd murder in the States and Black Lives Matter and the incredible resurgence here to support that. I mean, I know I said to Martin, we had a massive rally in Newcastle, 5,000 people, and huge rallies in Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne as well. There is a lot of barriers. I mean, and I know it happened elsewhere with police to actually hold some of them rallies again. Back in the 1920s, and I wrote about that particular time period, I've written about it as being a police state for our people. And in some respects, some of us still believe that it is a police state for our people. You know, I'm not saying there are not some really good police out there today. We've got Aboriginal police officers and TI police officers as well. That certainly is a change. But you look at the whole situation of, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, what clearly showed to us Aboriginal deaths in custody. You know, and we heard the report come through, but what has happened in those years since then? Over 470 Aboriginal people have continued to die in custody where they ignored, you know, all the recommendations. People have got to stop this idiotic behaviour and sit down and listen to us and support us in taking ways and means to solve the issues. There is no one better placed than Indigenous people to advise, direct and solve the issues that impact onto our communities. That's the thing that really needs to be done. We still suffer from, we know what's best for you. And that's the problem we still face today. Until we get past that hurdle and they begin to buckle in the weight of that and listen to us, it's only when we can make some serious change.
Any other questions in the room?
Stephen?
Thank you, John. Marvellous presentation. I'm interested in the situation where you raised the point about it's impractical to have a future unless you have a past. And with the government's position at the moment where the humanities are being almost erased through financial disincentives for people to undertake humanities and arts programs. I'm just wondering whether you've seen any parallels in other cultures, knowing that you're a scholar of American First Nations people as well, and whether there are any parallels that you might see or any observations you could make that might help us.
That's a global move as far as what the university sector, not just here, it's overseas, and it's the political climate we're in. And certainly the government here, I think, believes that the humanities is the enemy and need to be stopped and silenced and erased. I mean, this is stupidity. Universities are about discussion and argument and debate. Well, that's what they should be, you know, so that needs to be encouraged. And as I said there, the STEM subjects are important. But as I said, history at this critical moment in this crazy world is really very, very important at this point in time. And we've got to take steps to ensure that happens. Truth telling, that's a process this country needs to go through. If we are to have a future where we can join hands and walk towards a future that is just and equitable for all, we have to deal with the past. You can't sweep it under the carpet. We've got to have that discussion. The country's got to be mature enough to step up to that. And that's the reality where I certainly hope truth-telling becomes a major project in this country, and it really is where we go in the next 2 or 3 years. And fingers crossed that it can happen.
Thank you.
While people are thinking of questions, Alison Craven has asked a very similar question, Stephen, so we might go to Catherine Blackmore's question. Professor Maynard, in your lecture, you mentioned black schools for children so they can learn their heritage. Would you please comment on what students, and I'm very interested in that statement.
Yeah, black schools, I mean, where did I mention that?
I think Professor Smallwood mentioned that.
Oh, right, okay, right, yep. Well, look, I think we have Aboriginal schools around the country. I mean, where there is that difference. I mean, we've got schools in Newcastle that are set up for Aboriginal kids. I think, and we've had a long discussion over a long time about a black university. That never got traction, but maybe when we're long gone, it'll happen. But these are important discussions, I mean, because the reality is about the importance of Aboriginal kids being in a space where they are culturally safe. And they've got people, I mean, there are locations like here with the centre that Martin heads here. You know, Indigenous students are safe. When I went to Wallatuka at the University of Newcastle in late 1993, I said I left school when I was 15. I don't have any fond memories of school. All I remember of school was getting the cane, basically told I was wasting their time. And I spent the whole time up till I was 15 staring out the window thinking things must be better on the outside than they are in here. But going to Wallatuka by just luck and getting kidnapped into that diploma course, here was an Indigenous centre with all Indigenous lecturers, all Indigenous staff. I took to that space like a duck to water, and there was incredible support, and that continues on here. That's what we have in these spaces that do such outstanding results for our students. And they're critically important. So we need, yes, we need possibly schools, you know, in that space, but we still need centres in these institutions where we have our people that are leading the discussions and the direction of where we go and what's to be done. That's the critical things, that we are actually in charge and making the decisions.
So we've got two questions here that are fairly similar from Natalie and Laura Wright. So maybe I'll just go to Natalie's because they ask you similar kind of questions. Thank you so much for such an amazing and inspirational speech. In particular, the story about Douglas Grant, what an inspiration. And I really would love to use this example in my teaching. I want to know if I can tell this story in respect about discrimination has no boundaries. And to be honest, this still happens today, as we all know. Do you think that is a fair statement? And the other one from Laura is, thanks for an excellent presentation. Do you know of any history books documenting frontier wars in Central Australia? I've read up the histories on parks, around national parks, but I've never found any external resources that could help share it with people from the city.
Yeah. Right, where to start on that one? Talking about the massacres, I mean, headed by Lyndall Ryan at the University of Newcastle is the massacre maps at the moment, which is a national project. People can go on and have a look at that online at the University of Newcastle. Lyndall Ryan's done an incredible job on that. The other one was a book on, what was it again? I was involved with the Mick Dodson on the Serving Our Country project. If you wanted to have material about Douglas Grant, there's a book, Serving Our Country, which I did the chapter on World War I. There's material there on Douglas Grant. And also a non-Indigenous professor from the University of Newcastle, John Ramsden, did a great book probably 2 or 3 years ago on Douglas Grant. So I'm actually involved with a film, and I'm actually speaking on Saturday night at the Indigenous Film Festival because Tom Murray, the filmmaker, made a film about Douglas Grant. Tommy Lewis, you know, Chandler Jimmy Blacksmith, who sadly passed a few years ago. Tommy was involved with that film, and I was approached by Tom because Tommy Lewis had a heart attack and died. And Tom Murray said, look, John, would you be prepared not to come in as an actor but speak as a historian to finish this film that Tommy was so inspired to tell? And his family were also wanting the story told because Tommy Lewis said the Douglas Grant story spoke to him. He could see the Douglas Grant story in his own experiences of the chant of Jimmy Blacksmith. He said, suddenly after that film, I was an international movie star, a celebrity, you know, come basically overnight. But just as quickly, the backslappers disappeared. And Tommy had some demons to hurdle throughout his life. But he got to the end and did resurrect himself. And that's why he wanted this story told, because he said, I'm playing me, telling Douglas Grant's story. And he features in this film, which if people go online, they could probably have a look at that film on Saturday night at the Indigenous Film Festival. This is being shown, and I'm on the panel discussing it after that. So if you want to have a look. So Tom Murray's done a great film, and Tommy Lewis was excellent, you know. Yeah.
No. Last question.
Well, can I ask? My final question is, so you spoke about intergenerational trauma right at the beginning of your lecture. My parents and grandparents lived under British colonial rule, and successive generations of my family are still feeling that trauma today.
Yep.
What part do historians, students of history, and even members of institutions like James Cook University have in that healing process? Because that's one reason that certainly I've gotten involved in this study.
It's critically important to help people and assist people get their stories down. The most important thing when you look at, and I did a lot of interviews with war veterans, Vietnam in particular with that big project and other military wars, the trauma they come back from, the experience they suffered in the war, like Douglas Grant, our people have suffered that as well. And the most important thing for war veterans is to get them to talk. People bottle up their experiences and many don't talk even to their own families. Over the years, I've done lots of interviews with stolen generations, and I still carry the memories of some of those stories. I'll carry those to the day I die. And some of those stories have not been released. I recorded them, but people said, I want to tell you a story, but I don't want this out there. I just want someone to listen. And you're hearing something that even their own families haven't heard. And believe me, it's like a pressure valve being slammed down, which suddenly comes up. Those stories do need to be told, even if they're not released, because the relief that these people have, and I've had people cry with me and say, thank you for listening, and listening and helping me speak about this. So it is critically important we get these stories down and that people and institutions and historians assist that process. And I hope to see that's a part of the truth-telling process over the next 2 or 3 years, because that will assist in that healing process. And as I said in the talk, it's not just us. This country needs to heal. It's carrying a deep-seated wound that needs to be fixed.
Thank you, John. I think you've earned your meal now. Ladies and gentlemen, can you join me in thanking John?
Thank you.